6 surnames, 6 histories, over 1,000 years of stories compressed into the names 90 million Americans carry today. This is the complete first series of The Name You Carry, from Smith to Henry, from Norman conquests to American freedom. Settle in. This is going to take a while. This name is carried by over 3 million people alive right now, 2.4 million in America, over 500,000 in England, 200,000 in Canada, over 100,000 in Australia. It's the most common surname in the United States, the most common in Canada, the most common in Australia, and the most common in the United Kingdom. 4 countries, 3 continents, 1 name. But here's what makes this strange. These 3 million people are not related. They don't share a bloodline. They don't descend from a single family. There was no King Smith who founded a dynasty. No Smith clan that conquered nations. So how did one name end up on 3 million people? The answer involves a medieval job that no longer exists, a British Empire that spread it across the world, and a lie that most Smiths believe about their own ancestry. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how a job title became the most dominant surname in the English-speaking world. And if your name is Smith, you might learn something about your family you never knew. Let's start at the beginning, a time when surnames didn't exist at all. Imagine living in England in the year 1000. You're a farmer. You wake up before dawn, tend to your crops, and go to sleep when the sun sets. Your entire world is a village of maybe 50 people. And you have one name, just one. You're John. Your neighbor is William. The woman who sells eggs is Agnes, and that's enough, and because everyone knows everyone. But then, something changed. Populations started growing. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. And suddenly, you didn't know everyone anymore. When someone shouted John in the market square, 5 heads turned. When a tax collector came looking for William, there were 3 Williams to choose from. This was a problem. And the solution? Add a second name, a descriptor, something to tell all the Johns apart. John who lives on the hill? John Hill. John with the red hair? John Reed. John whose father was Robert? John Robertson. John who works at the forge? John Smith. Now here's the key. And this is where most people get the history wrong. These weren't family names yet. Not at first. If John the blacksmith had a son named Thomas who became a baker, Thomas might be called Thomas Baker. The name described you, not your bloodline. It wasn't until the 13th and 14th centuries that surnames became hereditary, passed down from father to child regardless of what that child actually did for a living. And that's when things got interesting. Because once Smith became a name you inherited rather than earned, it started spreading. Fast. But why Smith? Why not Baker or Taylor or Cooper? They were all common jobs too. The answer comes down to one thing: geography. And it explains why Smith absolutely dominates. But first you need to understand just how important a blacksmith was to medieval survival. Let me show you something. This is a typical medieval English village, about 100 people, farmers mostly. A church in the center, a mill by the river, and right here, the blacksmith. Now think about everything this village needs to survive. The farmer needs a plow, that's iron. He needs a scythe for harvest. Iron. Nails to build a barn. Iron. Hinges for every door. Iron. Horseshoes for every horse. Iron. Pots for cooking, knives for eating, tools for building, iron, 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 and who makes all of it? One man, the smith. Here's what made blacksmiths different from every other trade. A baker? Useful, but you could bake bread at home. A tailor? Valuable, but your wife could sew clothes. A carpenter? Important, but basic woodwork wasn't beyond a farmer's skill. But a blacksmith? You cannot forge iron without specialized knowledge, a forge, a bellows, an anvil, and years of training. The barrier to entry was enormous, which meant every single village, no matter how small, needed a dedicated smith. Historians estimate that 1 to 2% of the entire working male population in medieval England were smiths of some kind. Now I know what you're thinking. 1 to 2%? That doesn't sound like much. But here's where the math gets crazy. Let's say in the year 1300, there are about 4 million people in England. Half are male, half of those are working age. That's roughly 1 million working men. 1 to 2% of 1 million, that's 10,000 to 20,000 blacksmiths. Now, every single one of them passes the name Smith to their children, and their children's children, for 700 years. That's roughly 25 to 30 generations of compounding. And unlike a name like King, which might only belong to one family who served royalty, the name Smith was scattered across every village in England. Not concentrated, distributed. That's the secret. It's not that Smith was the most common job. It's that it was the most evenly distributed job. Bakers clustered in towns. Fletchers existed only near armies. Chandlers worked in cities. But Smiths were everywhere. And when a name is everywhere, it multiplies everywhere. But Smith didn't stop at England's borders. In the 1600s, this name did something no one could have predicted. It got on a boat. Actually, it got on thousands of boats. The year is 1607. A group of English settlers land on the coast of what is now Virginia. They call their settlement Jamestown. It's the first permanent English colony in America. And one of their leaders? A man named John Smith. Yes, that John Smith. The one from the Pocahontas story. Now, whether those legends are true, that's a whole other video. But here's what matters for us. His name wasn't special. It wasn't unique. John Smith was already one of the most common names in England. He was basically the John Doe of his time, and he wasn't the only Smith on those early ships. Look at any colonial ship manifest and you'll find them. Smith. 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 Thousands of Smiths left England for the American colonies. They settled in Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Carolina. And they did what families do. They had children, lots of children. By the time of American independence in 1776, Smith was already the most common surname in the new nation. But America wasn't the only place British colonizers went. In 1788, the first fleet arrived in Australia. Convicts, soldiers, and settlers, all carrying British surnames. What was the most common surname among them? Take a guess. Smith. Canada? Same story. British colonization. British names. Smith at the top. By the 1800s, Smith wasn't just an English name anymore. It was an empire name. Wherever the Union Jack flew, Smiths followed. But wait. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Not all the Smiths in America actually came from English families named Smith. Some of them were made. Between 1892 and 1954, over 12 million immigrants passed through Ellis Island. Many came from Germany, Poland, Italy, Russia, countries where the name Smith didn't exist. But a lot of them chose to leave their old names behind. You see, there is a popular myth that Ellis Island officers accidentally wrote down the wrong names. Historians actually tell us that's not true. The officers were just checking the ship's manifest. The real story is much more interesting. A German family named Schmidt steps off the boat. They are hungry, they need a job, they need a loan. And they realize very quickly that life is harder if you sound foreign. So they make a choice. They don't change their name because of a clerical error. They change it as a survival tactic. Schmidt becomes Smith. Kowalski becomes Smith. They voluntarily anglicize their own names to assimilate, to fit in, to sound American. So the name didn't just multiply through birth, it multiplied through absorption. Smith became a melting pot inside a melting pot. And that's why today not every Smith is English. Not every Smith descends from a blacksmith. Some Smiths are German, some are Polish, some are Jewish, some are Irish. The name absorbed them all. Now, with over 3 million Smiths in the world, you'd expect some of them to become famous. And they did. In almost every field you can imagine. Adam Smith, the Scottish economist who wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776. He's literally called the father of modern capitalism. Every time someone mentions the invisible hand, or free markets, that's Adam Smith. He changed how the entire world thinks about money. And his name? Smith. Will Smith. From the streets of West Philadelphia to one of the biggest movie stars on earth. Fresh Prince, Men in Black, Ally, I Am Legend. And yes, that Oscars moment. Whatever you think of him now, there's no denying. He made the name Smith famous in a completely different way. Dame Maggie Smith. If you grew up with Harry Potter, she was Professor McGonagall. If you watched Downton Abbey, she was the Dowager Countess delivering the sharpest one-liners on television. One of the most decorated actresses in British history. A Smith, Patti Smith, the godmother of punk rock, poet, rebel, the woman who proved rock and roll belonged to everyone. When they built the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Patti Smith was in it. Sam Smith, the voice behind some of the most emotional ballads of the 2010s and 2020s. Grammys, Oscars, global stardom, also a Smith. And then there's Joseph Smith, founder of the Latter-day Saint movement, one of the most significant religious figures in American history, a man whose teachings now have over 17 million followers worldwide. Say what you will about religion, the impact is undeniable. Scientists, economists, actors, musicians, religious founders, athletes, politicians. The name Smith has touched nearly every corner of human achievement. But here's the honest truth about this. The Smiths didn't dominate because they were special. They dominated because there were so many of them. When 3 million people carry a name, statistically, some of them will become extraordinary. It's math, not destiny. And there's something beautiful about that. Smith isn't a name of kings. It's not a name of conquerors. It's a name of people who worked with their hands, who built things, who made the tools that made civilization possible. And through sheer numbers, they ended up building a legacy. Today, the name Smith is so common it's almost become invisible. Think about it. When you check into a hotel and don't want to use your real name, what do you write? John Smith. When Hollywood needs a generic alias for a spy, what do they pick? John Smith, Jane Smith, Mr. and Mrs. Smith. The name has become a placeholder, a default, the human equivalent of example@email.com. And if your name actually is Smith, you've probably experienced something specific. Someone doubts you. Is that your real name? Like you made it up? Like you're hiding something? The most common surname in your country. And people think it sounds fake. There's an irony there. But for the millions of actual Smiths, the name carries something else. It carries 800 years of history. It carries the memory of an ancestor, someone you'll probably never identify by name, who once worked with fire and iron, who made nails and horseshoes and plows, who kept a village running. Their job became their name. Their name became your name. And here's something most Smiths never think about. The job still exists. There are blacksmiths today, artists and craftsmen keeping the old trade alive, but they're a tiny fraction of the people who carry the name. The rest? Teachers, doctors, engineers, lawyers, nurses, writers, drivers, coders, people whose only connection to the forge is 5 letters on their driver's license. 5 letters, 800 years, 4 continents, millions of lives, all because medieval villages needed someone to make their nails. That's the story of Smith, a job that became a name that crossed oceans, a name that absorbed immigrants and outlasted empires. It's not a story of royalty. It's a story of work, of ordinary people whose ordinary lives left an extraordinary mark. And here's the thing. Every surname has a story like this. Your name? It has a history, a journey, an origin hiding in plain sight. If your last name is Smith, now you know where it comes from. And now you know you're connected, not by blood but by name, to millions of people around the world. If your name isn't Smith, drop it in the comments. Tell me your surname, because it might be the next name we explore. Hit subscribe if you want to know more. In the next video, we dig into another surname, its history, its meaning, and the journey it took to reach you. I'm Benjamin. This is the name you carry. And this was Smith. This is the second most common surname in America. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, nearly 2 million people carry it. To be exact, the 2010 census recorded 1,932,812 Americans with this last name. It's also in the top 10 in England, Canada, and Australia. But unlike Smith, a name that came from a job, Johnson came from something else entirely. It came from a first name. Johnson, son of John. That's it, that's the whole meaning. Which raises a question that nobody thinks to ask: why John? There were Williams and Roberts and Richards. There were Edwards and Henrys and Thomases. All common names, all had sons. So why did son of John become the second most common surname in the English-speaking world, while Robertson doesn't even crack the top 50? The answer takes us back over 1,000 years, to a name so powerful it was given to kings, saints, and prophets. A name so dominant that by the 16th century, it was the most popular male name in all of England. This is the story of how one first name created millions of last names. To understand why Johnson exists, you first have to understand why John became perhaps the most popular name in Western history, and it starts with religion. The name John comes from the Hebrew Yochanan, meaning God is gracious. In the Bible, there are two Johns that changed everything. John the Baptist, the prophet who baptized Jesus himself. He's considered one of the holiest figures in Christianity. In the Gospel accounts, Jesus said of him, "Among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater." And John the Apostle, the disciple Jesus loved most, the one who stood at the cross when others fled, the one who wrote the Gospel of John and, according to tradition, the book of Revelation. For medieval Christians, naming your son John wasn't just a choice. It was a blessing, a prayer, a way of placing your child under the protection of saints. But religion was only part of it. The name John was also royal. England had King John. Yes, the villain from Robin Hood, the one who signed the Magna Carta, but still a king. France had multiple King Johns. The Holy Roman Empire, Portugal, Poland, Sweden, Denmark. John sat on thrones across Europe throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. And then there were the popes. 21 popes have taken the name John, more than any other papal name in the 2,000-year history of the Catholic Church. The numbering actually goes up to John 23rd due to some medieval clerical errors. But the point stands: when the most powerful religious leaders on earth keep choosing the same name across centuries, it sends a message. So by the 16th century, John had become unstoppable. A study by historian Scott Smith Bannister, examining over 122,000 baptismal records from English parish registers between 1538 and 1700, found that John was consistently the most popular name for boys throughout the entire period. Not second, not tied, first place, decade after decade. Let that sink in. For over 150 years, if you were born male in England, there was a very good chance your parents named you John. And in some parishes, the numbers were even more dramatic. Records show villages where a quarter of all men shared the same first name. This was a problem, the same problem that created surnames in the first place. When someone yelled John in the village, chaos. So what did people do? They did what humans always do. They got specific. There's a naming system that's been used across almost every culture on Earth. It's called patronymic naming, and it's beautifully simple. You are identified by your father. If your father was John, you weren't just William. You were William John's son. Say it fast enough times, and John's son becomes Johnson. This happened all across the British Isles, but with different flavors. In Scotland, they added Mac, which means son of in Gaelic. Mac Ian, son of John, eventually became names like Macian. In Ireland, they used O, meaning descendant of. Sion is the Irish form of John, which is why you see surnames like O'Shane. In Wales, they added Ap, another word for son of. Ap John eventually compressed and evolved into surnames like Johns, Jones, and even Upjohn. But in England, the most common form was simply adding son to the end. John's son, Johnson, Robert's son, Robertson, William's son, Williamson. And here's the mathematical key. This is what made Johnson explode. If John was the most common male name for generations, then John was also the most common name for fathers. And if John was the most common name for fathers, then son of John was the most common patronymic. Multiply that across every village, every town, every city in England, then let it compound for 600 years. That's how you get 2 million Johnsons. But wait, There's something most people don't realize about how patronymics worked. Johnson wasn't always a permanent name. For centuries, it could change every single generation. Here's something that will twist your brain. Imagine you're William Johnson. William, son of John, living in England in the year 1200. You have a son. You name him Thomas. What's Thomas's surname? It's not Johnson. It's Williamson. Because the patronymic described him, not his family. He was Thomas, son of William. His identity came from his relationship to you, not to your father, your grandson. If Thomas has a son named Robert, he'd be Robert Thomason. The name changed every generation. Johnson, Williamson, Thomason. Each generation, a new name. This was the system for hundreds of years. A family could go through a dozen different surnames across just a few centuries. There was no family name in the modern sense. So how did Johnson become permanent? Between the 13th and 15th centuries, something shifted. Governments needed stable records. The crown needed to track who owed taxes. Churches needed to record baptisms, marriages, and deaths. Property needed clear lines of inheritance. You can't track a family across generations if their name changes every 25 years. So gradually, surnames froze in place. Whatever patronymic your family happened to have at that moment, stuck. If your great-great-great-grandfather happened to be son of John when this freezing occurred, congratulations. You're a Johnson forever, even if no one in your family has been named John for 500 years. Even if you have no idea who that original John was. And because so many men were named John at the moment surnames became hereditary, so many families became Johnson. The timing was everything. If the freeze had happened a century earlier or later, the distribution of patronymic surnames might look completely different. But the story doesn't end in medieval England, because like Smith, Johnson got on boats. And when it reached America, something unexpected happened. English settlers brought Johnson to America starting in the 1600s. It was already one of the most common names in England, so naturally, it became one of the most common names in the colonies. By the time of American independence in 1776, Johnson was firmly established among the most frequent surnames in the new nation. But here's where the American story diverges from the English one. In America, Johnson didn't just spread through English families, it spread through slavery. When enslaved Africans were brought to America, they were stripped of their names, their identities, their connections to their homelands and ancestors. After emancipation in 1865, millions of formerly enslaved people needed surnames. For the first time, they could legally have family names of their own. Some took the names of former enslavers. Others chose names of prominent figures they admired. And many simply adopted the most common American surnames they encountered. Johnson was one of those names. Today, according to U.S. Census data, nearly 35% of Americans with the surname Johnson are Black, making it the second most common surname among Black Americans after Williams. This means that when you meet a Johnson in America, you genuinely cannot assume their background. They might descend from English colonists who arrived in the 1600s. They might descend from enslaved Africans who chose a new name after freedom. They might descend from Scandinavian immigrants, because Swedish and Norwegian names like Johansson and Johansson were often simplified to Johnson when families arrived at American ports. They might descend from German immigrants whose name was originally Johann. The name absorbed them all. It became, like Smith, a melting pot inside a melting pot. And that's why Johnson is uniquely American in a way it isn't anywhere else. It's not just an English name transplanted. It's a name that carries multiple histories, multiple journeys, multiple stories of survival and reinvention, all in 7 letters. With nearly 2 million Johnsons in America alone, some were bound to become famous. And they did. At the highest levels of achievement. Start with the presidency. Andrew Johnson, the 17th president, who took office after Lincoln's assassination and oversaw the difficult early years of Reconstruction. Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, the 36th president, who signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, fundamentally reshaping American society. 2 presidents, 1 surname, both Johnsons. In sports, the name appears at the highest levels of nearly every field. Irvin "Magic" Johnson, one of the greatest basketball players in history, a 5-time NBA champion who revolutionized the point guard position. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, yes, his real surname, from professional wrestling champion to one of the highest-paid actors in Hollywood history. Michael Johnson, the sprinter who dominated the 1996 and 2000 Olympics with his distinctive upright running style and golden shoes, setting world records in both the 200 and 400 meters. Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight boxing champion, who won the title in 1908 and faced an entire system designed to stop him, inspiring generations of athletes who came after. In science, there's Katherine Johnson, the NASA mathematician whose orbital calculations were critical to the success of the first American crewed spaceflights. Her story, hidden for decades, was finally told in the book and film Hidden Figures. In music, there's Robert Johnson, the Mississippi blues legend who recorded just 29 songs before his death at 27, yet influenced virtually every rock and blues guitarist who followed. The myth says he sold his soul to the devil at a crossroads for his guitar skills. The truth is that his talent needed no supernatural explanation. Writers, athletes, presidents, scientists, artists, all Johnsons. But here's the honest truth about this. The Johnsons didn't dominate because they were special. They dominated because there were so many of them. When nearly 2 million people carry a name, statistically, some of them will become extraordinary. It's probability, not destiny. And there's something meaningful about that. Johnson isn't a name of kings. It's not a name of conquerors. It's a name that simply means I am someone's child. And from that humble origin came presidents, champions, and legends. Today, Johnson sits at number 2 in America, just behind Smith, just ahead of Williams. It's so common that it's almost become invisible. Background noise in the American phone book. But if you carry this name, here's what you carry with you. 1,000 years of history. The echoes of a first name so powerful that kings and popes claimed it for centuries. The legacy of medieval England, where John dominated the baptismal records generation after generation. The journeys of colonists who crossed an ocean looking for a new life. The resilience of enslaved people who built new identities from nothing after emancipation. The ambition of Scandinavian and German immigrants who Americanized their names for a fresh start. Johnson doesn't mean blacksmith or baker or any job at all. It means something far more fundamental. It means you are someone's child. Someone named John, probably a man you'll never identify who lived centuries ago in a village whose name has been forgotten, had a son, and that son's identity became your inheritance. That's what you carry. Not an occupation, not a location, a relationship, a connection to a father, passed down through dozens of generations. Son of John, Johnson. That's the story of Johnson. A first name so dominant it created millions of last names. A patronymic that froze in time and crossed oceans. A name that absorbed English colonists, freed slaves, and Scandinavian immigrants into one shared identity. It's not a story of royalty. It's a story of fatherhood, of generations, of a simple question asked millions of times across human history. Whose son are you? Every surname has a story like this. If your name is Johnson, now you know. You're connected to 1,000 years of Johns, and to millions of people around the world who carry the same 7 letters, each with their own journey that led them here. If your name isn't Johnson, drop it in the comments. Tell me your surname, because next time, it might be yours. Hit subscribe if you want to know more. New surname stories are coming. I'm Benjamin. This is the name you carry. And this was Johnson. October 14th, 1066. A field in southern England, mud and blood, the clash of iron, horses screaming. A Norman duke stands on a hillside, watching his cavalry charge uphill toward a wall of Anglo-Saxon shields. His name is William. By nightfall, the English king will be dead, an arrow through the eye if the legends are true, and this foreign invader will claim the throne of England. They will call him William the Conqueror. And here's what no one standing on that battlefield could have known. His victory wouldn't just change England's monarchy. It would change England's names. The name William, almost unknown in England before that day, would become the most popular male name in the country within 200 years. And 1,000 years later, 1.5 million Americans would carry a surname that exists for one reason: William I. But that's only half the story, because Williams isn't just the third most common surname in America. It's the most common surname among Black Americans. Not second, not tied. First, nearly 47% of everyone named Williams in the United States is Black. One surname, two conquests, 1,000 years apart. This is the story of how a conqueror's name became a nation's name, and then became something else entirely. To understand why Williams exists, you have to understand what England was before October 14th, 1066. The Anglo-Saxons had ruled for 600 years. Their names reflected their world: Ethelred, Edric, Godwin, Leofric. Names built from Old English roots carrying meanings of nobility, power, and God. The name William, it didn't exist in England, not really. It was a continental name: French, Norman, foreign. Then came Hastings. William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the English Channel with roughly 7,000 men and 600 ships. He defeated King Harold II in a single day of brutal combat. By Christmas, he was crowned in Westminster Abbey. And then the real conquest began. William didn't just take the throne. He took the land. He stripped Anglo-Saxon nobles of their estates and handed them to his Norman followers. By the time of the Domesday Book in 1086, William's great census of English wealth, only 2 English nobles still held significant land directly from the king. Everyone else, Norman, French, foreign, and they brought their names with them. Within a generation, something strange happened. The conquered started naming their children after the conquerors. William. The name meant resolute protector in the old Germanic tongue, from will, meaning will or desire, and helm, meaning helmet or protection. It was the name of the man who had crushed their armies, seized their land, and imposed a new order. And parents gave it to their sons. Why? Power, association, survival. If your lord was Norman, if your priest was Norman, if the king himself bore this name, then giving your child the same name wasn't admiration, it was strategy. It was a way of saying, we belong to this new world. By the 13th century, William was the most common male name in England, not among Normans, among everyone. The conquest had worked, not just militarily, but linguistically. The invader's name had become the nation's name. And then came the kings. William I, William II, later William III and William IV. 4 English kings bearing the same name across 800 years, each one reinforcing its power, its prestige, its permanence. Every time a King William sat on the throne, a generation of parents named their sons in his image. But there was one place where the conquest never fully took hold: Wales. The Welsh had their own language, their own laws, their own naming customs, and for centuries they resisted the English system of fixed surnames. In Wales, you weren't John Williams, you were Iwan ap Gwilym, Iwan, son of Gwilym, the Welsh form of John, son of William. That ap, meaning son of, was the key. It worked exactly like the English I son suffix, but it came before the father's name, not after. Owain ap William, Dafydd ap Gwilym, Rhys ap Thomas. Your name told everyone whose child you were, and it changed every generation. Your son wouldn't be ap William, he'd be ap Owain, and son of you. This system persisted in Wales for centuries longer than in England. As late as 1500, most Welsh people still used patronymics. There was no Williams family in the modern sense, just endless chains of fathers and sons, each generation's name dying with them. Then England forced the change. Between 1536 and 1543, the English Parliament passed the Laws and Wales Acts. The official purpose was administrative: integrate Wales fully into the English legal system, standardize courts, standardize records, standardize taxes. But there was a hidden consequence. English law required fixed surnames. You couldn't track property across generations if names changed every 25 years. You couldn't collect taxes reliably. You couldn't prove inheritance in court. So the Welsh were forced to choose. Take a permanent surname, now. And what names did they choose? The names of their fathers at that moment. If your father was Gwilym when the law changed, congratulations. You're a Williams forever. Even if no one in your family is named William for the next 500 years. Even if you've forgotten who that original Gwilym was. The name froze. And because William had been one of the most popular names in Wales for generations, thanks to English influence, Williams became one of the most common Welsh surnames almost overnight. Let me show you what this looked like in numbers. By the late 19th century, 1 in 14 Welsh farmers was named Williams. 1 in 14. Walk into any village in Caernarfonshire or Gwynedd, and you'd find Williams after Williams after Williams. The local church registry would list pages of them. The tax rolls were practically monotonous. Today, Williams ranks as the third most common surname in Wales, with over 110,000 bearers in a country of just 3 million people. That's roughly 1 in 27 Welsh people carrying the same surname. And here's what made Wales different from England. In England, surnames had frozen centuries earlier. The Williams families were old, established, dispersed across the country. In Wales, the freezing happened later, and all at once. It created a massive concentration of Williams families in a small geographic area, all adopting the same surname within a few generations. When Welsh people began emigrating, to England, to America, to Australia, they carried this concentration with them. The first Williams arrived in America with the early colonists. Roger Williams, founder of Rhode Island, champion of religious freedom, creator of one of the first democracies in the New World. His colony became a haven for Baptists, Quakers, and others fleeing persecution. The principles he established would echo through the Constitution 150 years later. But Roger Williams was just the beginning. Throughout the 1600s and 1700s, waves of Welsh immigrants settled in Pennsylvania, the Carolinas, and beyond. They brought their language, their hymns, their chapels, and their surnames. By the time of American independence, Williams was already among the most common surnames in the colonies. The 2010 census recorded 1,534,042 Americans named Williams. That's roughly 1 in every 200 people. But here's where the American story takes a turn that the Welsh could never have predicted. The Civil War ends. The 13th Amendment abolishes slavery. And millions of formerly enslaved people face a question that most Americans never have to consider. What is your name? Under slavery, enslaved people were often denied surnames entirely. They were listed in records by first name only, if they were listed at all. Their identities were not their own. After emancipation, they had to choose. Some took the surnames of former enslavers. Some chose the names of public figures they admired. And many simply adopted the most common American surnames they encountered. Names that would help them navigate a hostile world. Names that wouldn't mark them as different. Williams was one of those names. In the 1870 census, the first after emancipation, 70,696 Black Americans were recorded with the surname Williams. By 1900, that number had grown to 187,548. By 1940, it was 274,627. But today, the numbers tell a story that is unique in American history. According to the 2010 U.S. Census, over 1.6 million Americans carry the surname Williams. And here is the statistic that changes everything. 48.3% of them are Black. 45.7% of them are white. Sometime between the year 2000 and 2010, the scales tipped. Williams is no longer just a common name. It is now statistically the only major surname in the United States held by more Black people than white people. Smith is still majority white. Johnson is still majority white. But Williams? Williams has crossed the line. One surname, two completely different histories, and now a new majority. Let me give you the scale. The surname Williams is carried by approximately 2.95 million people worldwide, 1.5 million in the United States alone. In the UK, it ranks third, behind Smith and Jones. In Wales, Third, behind Jones and Davies. In Australia, fourth. In New Zealand, fifth. One name. Scattered across 4 continents. Spoken in dozens of accents. And all of it traces back to a single moment. A Norman duke crossing the English Channel with 7,000 men, changing the course of history with a single battle. The Anglo-Saxons who survived Hastings would have hated this name. It was the name of their conqueror, the name of oppression, the name of defeat. And within 200 years it was the most popular name in England. That's the mathematics of cultural conquest. The winners don't just take your land, they take your names, they take your children's names, and eventually those names become yours, become so deeply embedded that you forget they were ever foreign at all. With 1.5 million Williams in America, some were bound to become extraordinary. Tennessee Williams, the playwright who gave us A Streetcar Named Desire and The Glass Menagerie, whose work defined American theater for a generation. Serena and Venus Williams, sisters who dominated tennis for 2 decades, winning a combined 30 Grand Slam singles titles and changing the face of the sport. Robin Williams, the comedian and actor whose manic energy masked a profound depth, leaving behind performances in Good Will Hunting, Dead Poets Society, and dozens of other films. Hank Williams, the country music legend who died at 29 but wrote songs that still define the genre. Your Cheatin' Heart, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry. Pharrell Williams, Vanessa Williams, John Williams, the composer, William Carlos Williams, the poet. Athletes, artists, entertainers, creators. But here's the truth we've said before. The Williams didn't dominate because they were special. They dominated because there were so many of them. When 1.5 million people carry a name, statistically, some will become extraordinary. It's probability, not destiny. And there's something meaningful about that. Williams isn't a name of occupation. It's not Smith or Baker or Cooper. It's not a name of location. It's not Hill or Brooks or Atwood. It's a name of relationship, son of William, Mab Gwilym, child of a protector. But which William? If your family is Welsh, your Williams probably traces to someone named Gwilym who lived in the 1500s, a farmer or craftsman or laborer who happened to have that name when the English forced fixed surnames onto Wales. If your family is English, your Williams might go back further, perhaps to the 1200s or 1300s, when surnames first solidified in England. If your family is Black American, your Williams almost certainly dates to the 1860s or 1870s, chosen by an ancestor who had just claimed their freedom for the first time. 3 different origins, 3 different centuries, 3 different stories, all arriving at the same 7 letters. Today, Williams sits at number 3 in America, behind Smith, behind Johnson, just ahead of Brown and Jones. It's so common it's become invisible. Background noise. A name you've heard 1,000 times and never thought about. But if you carry this name, here's what you carry. The echo of a battle fought nearly 1,000 years ago, when a Norman duke changed the course of English history. The legacy of a name so powerful that the conquered adopted it as their own within generations. The stubbornness of Welsh culture, which held on to its patronymic traditions for 500 years until English law forced the change. The resilience of enslaved people who claimed new identities after emancipation and passed them down through generations. The journeys of immigrants, Welsh, English, Black, and others, who carried this name across oceans and into new worlds. Williams doesn't mean blacksmith. It doesn't mean son of John. It means son of a protector, son of William. But more than that, it means this. You are carrying a name that conquered England, survived in Wales, and was chosen, freely chosen, by people building new lives in America. A conqueror's name, a survivor's name, a free person's name. All at once. That's the story of Williams. A name born in conquest, frozen in Wales, chosen in freedom. Carried across 4 continents by millions of people who share nothing but 7 letters. It's not a story of one family. It's a story of many families, Welsh farmers and Norman lords and freed slaves and English colonists, all connected by a name they probably never chose. Every surname is like this if you look closely enough. Layer upon layer of history, compressed into a few letters on a driver's license. If your name is Williams, Now you know. You're connected to a Norman conqueror and a Welsh farmer and a freed slave, all at once. Your name carried them. Now it carries you. If your name isn't Williams, drop it in the comments. Tell me your surname, because next time, it might be yours. Hit subscribe if you want to know more. New surname stories are coming. I'm Benjamin, this is the name you carry, and this was Williams. Somewhere in medieval England 1,000 years ago, someone looked at your ancestor. Not at what they did, not at whose son they were, just at them. And what they saw was brown. Brown hair, brown skin, brown eyes, maybe brown clothing, the undyed wool of the poor. And that was enough. No forge required, no famous father, no land to inherit, just a single word, spoken once, remembered forever. Brown. Today, 1.4 million Americans carry this name. It's the fourth most common surname in the United States, the most common in Jamaica, second most common in Canada and the United Kingdom. And every single one of them traces back to that moment, the moment someone was described by how they looked. If your name is Brown, this is the story of how one glance became an identity. Before we understand Brown, we need to understand what surnames were actually for. In medieval England, most people didn't have last names. They didn't need them. Villages were small, maybe 50 to 200 people. Everyone knew everyone. John was John, Mary was Mary. If you needed to be specific, you just pointed. But as populations grew, as villages became towns, as kingdoms centralized and tax collectors needed to track who owed what, a single name wasn't enough anymore. So people started adding descriptors. These descriptors fell into four main categories. First, occupation. John who works the forge? John Smith, the man who makes barrels? Cooper, the one who bakes bread? Baker. Second, patronymic. Whose son are you? William's son became Williamson. John's son became Johnson. Third, location. Where do you live? By the hill? You're John Hill. Near the Ford? John Ford. By the Green? John Green. And fourth, the category that created Brown, appearance. What do you look like? The word brown comes from the Old English brun, same root in Old Norse brun, Old French brun, German braun. All meaning the same thing, a dark, earthy color. But here's where it gets interesting. Brown could mean several different things about a person. Brown could mean brown hair, the most common hair color in England. In a village where most people had similar coloring, the one person with notably darker or lighter hair would stand out. Brown could mean brown complexion, darker skin, weathered by sun and outdoor labor. A farmer who spent every day in the fields would look different from the miller who worked indoors. Brown could mean brown clothing, the undyed wool worn by peasants who couldn't afford expensive dyes. Blue, red, green, these required costly pigments. Brown was what you got when you couldn't afford anything else. And in some cases, brown might have been a nickname, a term of everyday identification, maybe even affection. Which John? The brown one. That's it. That's the whole origin. Your ancestor was pointed at, described, and that description became permanent. The earliest written records of Brown appear in the Domesday Book of 1086, William the Conqueror's Great Survey of England. There we find Brun and the Latinized Brunus, not yet surnames but personal names. By 1273 we have actual surnames, Hugh Le Brun in Suffolk, Robert Le Brun in Buckinghamshire. That Laird is French for the. Hugh Le Brun means Hugh the Brown One. This tells us Brown wasn't just an English name. It came from multiple sources, Anglo-Saxon roots, Norman French influence, even Old Norse contributions from Viking settlers. The same descriptor, emerging independently across languages, all pointing at the same human trait. Think about what this means compared to the surnames we've already covered. Smith meant your ancestor had a skill. They worked metal. They were essential to their community. The name carried professional respect. Johnson meant your ancestor had a notable father, someone important enough that being John's son meant something. The name carried lineage. Williams meant your ancestor was connected, at least nominally, to a name of conquest and power. But brown? Brown meant your ancestor existed. They had hair, they had skin, they wore clothes. That's the most democratic way to get a surname. You didn't need to be skilled. You didn't need a famous father. You didn't need to be connected to royalty. You just needed to be seen. And here's what makes appearance-based surnames special. They were everywhere. Every village had people with brown hair. Every community had workers with sun-darkened skin. Every population had peasants in undyed clothing. Unlike Smith, which required a forge, or Johnson, which required a father named John, Brown required nothing but existence. In a way, Brown is the most human of all surnames. It's the name that says someone noticed you. Let's talk numbers. Because Brown isn't just old, it's everywhere. In the 2010 U.S. Census, 1,437,026 Americans were named Brown. That makes it the fourth most common surname in America, behind Smith at 2.4 million, behind Johnson at 1.9 million, behind Williams at 1.5 million. But ahead of Jones, Garcia, Miller, and Davis. Worldwide, there are approximately 1.77 million Browns. The surname ranks 206th globally, which might not sound impressive until you realize there are literally millions of surnames in the world. But here's where geography gets really interesting. Brown is the most common surname in Jamaica. Number 1. More common than Williams, more common than Smith. It's the second most common in Canada and the United Kingdom. Fourth in Australia and the United States. One word. 5 countries. Millions of people. All because someone, somewhere, had brown features. And the demographic breakdown in America tells its own story. According to census data, approximately 60% of American Browns identify as white. About 35% identify as black. The remaining 5% includes Hispanic, Asian, and multiracial Americans. That 35% black figure is significant. It's one of the highest proportions among common English surnames. Which brings us to a part of the story that goes far beyond medieval England. The name Brown has a unique position in American history, not just because of how common it is, but because the name itself became a symbol, not just of a color, of a cause. And 2 Browns, one in 1859, one in 1954, changed America forever. October 16th, 1859. A Sunday night in Virginia. A 59-year-old man with a wild beard and burning eyes led 21 men out of a rented farmhouse in Maryland. They crossed the Potomac River in the darkness and descended on a small town called Harper's Ferry. The man's name was John Brown. His plan was audacious. Some would say insane. He would seize the federal armory at Harper's Ferry. He would capture its stockpile of 100,000 weapons. He would arm enslaved people throughout the region, and he would trigger a rebellion that would spread across the entire South, ending slavery through force. Brown's army included 5 black men and 3 of his own sons. They had trained for months. They had stockpiled weapons, including 950 iron pikes for enslaved people who didn't know how to use firearms. By midnight, they had taken the armory, the arsenal, and the rifle works. They had captured several hostages, including the great-grandnephew of George Washington. And then everything went wrong. The enslaved people didn't rise up. Word spread too slowly. Local militia arrived by morning. By afternoon, Brown and his surviving men were trapped in a small brick engine house, surrounded by hundreds of armed men. The next morning, U.S. Marines under Colonel Robert E. Lee stormed the building. 10 of Brown's raiders were killed. Brown himself was wounded, captured, and dragged to trial. The trial lasted 5 days. The verdict was guilty: treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, conspiracy to incite slave insurrection, and murder. The sentence was death. On December 2, 1859, John Brown was hanged. Before his execution, he handed a guard a slip of paper. It read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." 18 months later, the Civil War began. Among those present at John Brown's raid or execution, Robert E. Lee, who would command the Confederate Army; Stonewall Jackson, who would become Lee's greatest general; John Wilkes Booth, who would assassinate Abraham Lincoln. Historians still argue about whether John Brown was a hero, a terrorist, or a madman, but no one disputes his impact. His raid on Harper's Ferry is considered one of the primary sparks that ignited the Civil War. A man named Brown, literally a man whose surname meant the Dark One, became the match that set America on fire. So if your name is Brown, what does it actually mean about you? Here's what we know for certain. You are descended from someone who was described by their appearance. Brown hair, brown skin, brown clothing, maybe all three. Maybe something else entirely that a medieval observer associated with the color brown. That description happened somewhere in the medieval period, most likely between the 11th and 14th centuries, in England, Scotland, Ireland, or the German-speaking regions of Europe. At some point, that description stopped being a description and became a name. Inherited. Permanent. Yours. But here's what we don't know. We don't know which Brown you descend from. Was it the Anglo-Saxon Brune from before the Norman conquest? The Norman Le Brun who came with William the Conqueror? The Scottish Brown from the lowlands? The German Braun who immigrated to America and anglicized the spelling? We don't know if your ancestor was proud of the name, indifferent to it, or perhaps even assigned it against their will after emancipation. We don't know if the name described their hair, their skin, their clothing, their work, or something else entirely. The name Brown is a description that became an identity. But the specifics, the individual story, was never recorded. What we do know is this. You carry a name that connects you to millions of people across centuries and continents, all linked by a single observation made 1,000 years ago. I started this video with an image. Someone looking at your ancestor, not judging, not employing, not fathering, just seeing. And what they saw, whatever shade of brown it was, became permanent. There's something profound about that. In a world where surnames often celebrated skill, lineage, or land, Brown celebrated nothing except existence. You were seen. You were named. And here you are, 1,000 years later, still carrying that moment. Brown is the fourth most common surname in America, 1.4 million people, 1.77 million worldwide. Some descended from medieval peasants in English villages who had notably dark hair. Some from enslaved people who chose a new name after emancipation. Some from German immigrants who changed Braun to Brown at the border. Some from families who simply wanted a common, unremarkable American-sounding name. All of them connected by a single word, a single observation, a single moment of being seen. The name didn't come from what your ancestor did. It came from what your ancestor was. And that might be the most honest origin story of all. That's the story of Brown. A nickname that became permanent. A description that crossed oceans. A name that absorbed medieval peasants, freed slaves, and German immigrants into one shared identity. It's not a story of skill. It's not a story of lineage. It's a story of simply being seen, of a single glance 1,000 years ago that gave your family its name. Every surname has a story like this. If your name is Brown, now you know. You're connected to everyone who ever looked at their ancestor and saw something earthy, something grounded, something brown, and to millions of people around the world who carry the same 5 letters, each with their own journey that led them here. If your name isn't Brown, drop it in the comments. Tell me your surname. Because next time, it might be yours. Hit subscribe if you want to know more. New surname stories are coming. I'm Benjamin. This is the name you carry. And this was Brown. Wales has no letter J. The Welsh alphabet, one of the oldest written languages in Europe, has 29 letters. And J is not one of them. Yet the most common surname in Wales is Jones. Let that contradiction sink in. A nation defined by its language, its poetry, its fierce cultural pride, and its most widespread family name is built around a letter that doesn't exist in that language. This is the story of how that happened, and what it cost. If you watched our Johnson video, you already know part of this story. Johnson means son of John. Simple. English. Add son to your father's name, and you have a surname. Jones means exactly the same thing. Son of John. Same meaning. Same origin. Same Hebrew root, Yohanan, God is gracious, that gave us saints and kings and popes for 1,000 years. But Jones is not English. Jones is Welsh. And the path from John to Jones tells a very different story than the path from John to Johnson. In England, they added son. John's son became Johnson. In Wales, they had a different system entirely. And when that system was destroyed, Jones is what survived. Before the 1500s, the Welsh didn't have surnames, not in the way we understand them. They had something older, something more complex, something that English officials found completely unmanageable. They had patronymics that functioned as portable family trees. Here's how it worked. In Wales, you didn't just carry your father's name. You carried your father's name, and his father's name, and his father's name, going back 7, 8, 9 generations. The word ap meant son of. For women, Fyrch meant daughter of. So a man might be called Llewellyn ap Dafydd, ap Iwan ap Gruffudd, ap Meredith, ap Liwarch ap Gwalchmai. A woman might be Angharad Fyrch Morgan ap Evan ap Caradoc. That's not a name, that's a lineage. 7 generations of fathers, encoded in a single introduction. For the Welsh, this wasn't bureaucratic complication. This was identity. This was law. The 9th century Welsh king Hywel Dda, Hywel the Good, had declared that to own land, you needed to trace your descent from the original holders. Your name wasn't just identification. It was a legal document. It was proof of inheritance. It was your right to exist in Welsh society. In 1292, a study of Welsh records found that 48% of all names were patronymics. In some parishes, over 70%. The system worked because everyone understood it. When you introduced yourself with 7 generations of ancestry, you weren't showing off. You were establishing your place in the world. Your name was your family history spoken aloud. In 1536, Henry VIII decided to fully incorporate Wales into England. The Laws and Wales Acts, sometimes called the Acts of Union, didn't just change borders, they changed identity. They changed language. They changed what it meant to be Welsh. English became the only legal language in Welsh courts. Anyone who wanted to hold public office, serve on a jury, or own certain types of property had to speak English. Welsh, one of the oldest living languages in Europe, was banned from official life, and the Welsh were told to take English-style surnames. No more 9-generation genealogies, no more ap Dafydd ap Iwan. Pick a surname. Make it permanent. Pass it to your children unchanged. The shift didn't happen overnight. The gentry adopted fixed surnames first. They had the most to lose by being locked out of government. Commoners held on longer. In some rural areas, the old patronymic system persisted into the 1700s and even the 1800s. But the clerks and officials who implemented the law had a problem. How do you convert a system designed to preserve ancestry into a system designed to simplify taxation? They asked the Welsh, "What is your father's name?" And if your father was named John, or the Welsh form Sion, then you became Jones. Not John's son, not Apsion, just Jones. Hundreds of years of genealogy, compressed into 5 letters. The timing could not have been worse. At the exact moment the Welsh were forced to adopt permanent surnames, Europe was going through a dramatic simplification of first names. The Protestant Reformation was in full swing. Henry VIII had just broken from Rome. The old Celtic names, the Liwarchs and the Gwalchmais, suddenly seemed dangerously pagan. Catholic devotional names were politically suspect. Safe names were biblical names, English names, names like John. So in the 1530s and 1540s, across Wales, an entire generation of fathers were named John, Sion in Welsh. And when their children were told to take permanent surnames, they all became Jones. Professor Price Morgan, co-author of Welsh Surnames, describes it as a tragedy of timing. There were hundreds and hundreds of people being forced to take fixed surnames at the very time when there were hundreds and hundreds of fathers being given the name John. Instead of being Liwarch ap Gwalchmai ap Gwasmihangel, you ended up being John Jones. And that's all. John Jones. Hundreds and hundreds of John Jones. Today approximately 1,425,470 Americans carry the surname Jones. That makes it the fifth most common surname in the United States, just behind Smith, Johnson, Williams, and Brown. But America isn't where Jones dominates. In Wales, Jones is number one, not by a small margin, by a landslide. Nearly 6% of the entire Welsh population, close to 170,000 people in a nation of just 3 million, share this single surname. In some Welsh villages, the concentration is even higher. Historic records show parishes where 15% or more of the population were Joneses, all unrelated, all descended from different men named John who happened to be fathers in the 1500s. This created a problem that Wales solved with characteristic creativity. When everyone in your village is named Jones, you need a way to tell them apart. The Welsh developed a system of nicknames that became almost poetic. You weren't just Jones. You were Jones the bread if you were a baker, Jones the milk if you delivered dairy, Die Up and Down Jones if you had one leg slightly shorter than the other. There's an old joke, possibly apocryphal, definitely beloved, about an American spy sent to Wales during World War II to meet a contact named Jones. He approaches a farmer. "I'm looking for a man called Jones." "Well, you're in luck," says the farmer. "There's Jones the butcher, Jones the baker, Jones the blacksmith, even my name is Jones." "Aha," thinks the spy. He whispers the secret code. The sun is shining, the grass is growing, the cows are ready for milking. "Oh," says the farmer, "you want Jones the spy." In 2008, when Wales competed in the Six Nations Rugby Championship, 7 of the 15 players on the team were named Jones. The commentators had to get creative. Here's the deepest irony of Jones. The Welsh language has no letter J. Never has. The Welsh alphabet has 29 letters, including double letters like CH, DD, FF, NG, LL, PH, RH, and TH that count as single letters in Welsh. But J, foreign, doesn't exist. The sound exists. They spell it with psi or eo, but the letter itself is English. John in Welsh is Sion, pronounced roughly like Sean. Apsion, son of John, should have become something like Sion or Shone, and in some cases it did. The surnames Sions and Shone exist. So does the pure Welsh form Sion as a surname. But when English clerks recorded Welsh names in English documents, they wrote what they heard with English spelling. Sion became John. Apsion became Jones. Wales's most common surname is an English spelling of a Welsh name, using a letter the Welsh language doesn't have, imposed by a law designed to erase Welsh identity. And yet, the Welsh kept it. They made it theirs. They turned Jones into something unmistakably, defiantly Welsh. On November 3, 2006, something remarkable happened in Cardiff. 1,224 people named Jones gathered at the Millennium Center to break the world record for the largest gathering of people with the same surname. They shattered the previous record of 583, held by the Norbergs of Sweden. They were greeted by live performances from Grace Jones and opera soprano Dame Gwyneth Jones. They received video messages from Tom Jones and Catherine Zeta-Jones. For one evening, Jones wasn't common. It was a celebration. An English imposition had become a Welsh inheritance. A forced simplification had become a point of pride. Jones didn't stay in Wales. Welsh immigrants brought the name to America, to Australia, to anywhere Welsh miners and farmers sought new opportunities. The Welsh were famous for their coal mining expertise, and where coal was discovered, Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, Welsh Joneses followed. But in America especially, Jones absorbed other stories. Like Williams and Johnson, Jones became a surname adopted by Black Americans after emancipation. The numbers are significant. Nearly 38% of Americans named Jones today are Black, over 540,000 people. That makes Jones the third most common surname among Black Americans, after Williams and Johnson. The reasons were similar to other common surnames. Some freed people took the names of former enslavers. Others chose common, respectable names to start fresh. Jones was everywhere. Jones was safe. Jones was American. Mary Jones of Chicago is one example. Born Mary Richardson to free parents in Tennessee, she married John Jones in 1841. The couple became abolitionists and moved to Chicago. Mary turned their home into a station on the Underground Railroad, personally escorting fugitive slaves to trains bound for Canada. When John Brown and his crew passed through on their way to Harper's Ferry, Mary gave them shelter and clothing. John Jones became one of the wealthiest black businessmen in Chicago. When he died in 1879, Mary inherited a legacy built on a surname that had traveled from Wales to freedom. This means that when you meet a Jones in America, you genuinely cannot assume their story. They might descend from Welsh immigrants who arrived in the 1700s. They might descend from enslaved people who chose a new name after freedom. They might descend from English families who'd carried the name for centuries before crossing the Atlantic. The name absorbed them all. In 1913, a cartoonist named Arthur R. "Pop" Momond created a comic strip for the New York Globe. It was called Keeping Up with the Joneses. The strip followed the McGinnis family, Aloysius, Clarice, and their daughter Julie, as they tried desperately to match the lifestyle of their wealthy neighbors, the Joneses. The Joneses themselves never appeared in the strip, not once in 25 years. They were an unseen ideal, always just out of reach, always one purchase ahead. Momond knew what he was satirizing. Before becoming a cartoonist, he'd lived in a wealthy New York suburb where he and his wife had tried to match their neighbors' lifestyles. They'd nearly bankrupted themselves in the process. Eventually, they gave up and moved to Manhattan, where Momond turned his humiliation into art. He said he'd considered calling it Keeping Up with the Smiths, but Jones had a better ring to it. More euphonious, he said. That single syllable that slides out of the mouth almost before it begins. The comic ran for 25 years, ending in 1938. Momond himself lived to be 100 years old. And long after the strip was forgotten, long after the McGinnis family faded from memory, the phrase survived. Keeping up with the Joneses became shorthand for the endless American pursuit of status through consumption. The Norwegian-American economist Thorstein Veblen had introduced the concept of conspicuous consumption in 1899. Momond gave it a catchphrase. The Joneses were no longer Welsh, they weren't even people. They were an abstraction, the neighbors who always had more, the standard you could never quite reach. It's a strange immortality for a surname born from cultural erasure. A name forced on people who lost their genealogies now represents the universal human tendency to compare ourselves to others. With 1.4 million Americans carrying the name, some were bound to become extraordinary. In music, there's Tom Jones, born Thomas John Woodward in Pontypridd, Wales in 1940. His mother's maiden name was Jones, and when he needed a stage name, he took it. 60 years of hits followed, from It's Not Unusual to Sex Bomb, the Welsh baritone who became an international icon. He sold over 100 million records. He's been knighted, and he's still performing in his 80s. There's Quincy Jones, the legendary producer behind Michael Jackson's Thriller, the best-selling album in history. Jones produced 3 of Jackson's solo albums and won 28 Grammy Awards, more than any other artist or producer. There's Norah Jones, whose debut album Come Away With Me won 8 Grammy Awards in a single night in 2003, including Album of the Year and Record of the Year. In film, there's James Earl Jones, whose voice became 2 of cinema's most iconic characters, Darth Vader in Star Wars and Mufasa in The Lion King. He won 2 Tony Awards, an Emmy, a Grammy, and received an honorary Oscar. When he passed in 2024, both Disney and Lucasfilm announced they would preserve his voice using AI for future projects. There's Tommy Lee Jones, the Harvard-educated Texan who won an Oscar for The Fugitive and became one of Hollywood's most reliably intense character actors. There's Catherine Zeta-Jones, born in Swansea, Wales, who won an Oscar for Chicago and became one of the few Welsh actors to achieve sustained Hollywood stardom. And then there are the fictional Joneses. Indiana Jones, the archaeologist-adventurer created by George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, who made the surname synonymous with impossible escapes and ancient mysteries. Harrison Ford has played the character across 5 films spanning 4 decades. Bridget Jones, whose diary turned romantic comedy into cultural phenomenon. Jessica Jones, the Marvel superhero. Jughead Jones from Riverdale. The Atlantic noted that Jones became the perfect surname not for dullness but for adventure. That single stressed syllable acts as the straight man to any outrageous first name. Indiana Jones, Cleopatra Jones. The surname grounds the absurd and makes it believable. If your name is Jones, what do you carry? You carry a letter that doesn't exist in the language of your name's origin. You carry the echo of a system, Ap Sion, Ap David, Ap Yuan, that once encoded 7 generations of ancestry in a single introduction. You carry the moment when Henry VIII decided that Wales would speak English or lose its voice in government. You carry the clerks who simplified, and the fathers who were named John, and the children who became Jones. You carry Welsh villages where everyone shared your name but not your blood. You carry the creativity of Jones the Bred and Jones the Spy. If your ancestors were Black Americans, you carry the moment of choosing, the decision to take a common name and make it your own, to build identity from freedom. You carry 1,224 people gathering in Cardiff to celebrate a shared surname. You carry 7 rugby players on the same national team. You carry a comic strip from 1913 and a phrase that outlived it by a century. Every surname is an artifact, a fossil of the moment when fluid identities became fixed names. But Jones is something more. Jones is evidence of what survives when cultures collide. The Welsh lost their patronymic system. They lost the ability to introduce themselves with 7 generations of ancestry. They lost names like Lewarch ap Gwalchmai ap Gwasmihangel that encoded history and land rights and identity. What they kept was Jones, a simplified, anglicized, imposed surname that somehow, over 500 years, became the most Welsh name imaginable. A name that sounds more Welsh than names that were actually Welsh. That's what adaptation looks like. That's what survival looks like, not purity, but persistence. Taking what was forced upon you and making it unmistakably yours. 1.4 million Americans, 170,000 Welsh, millions more scattered across the English-speaking world, all carrying 5 letters that began as Apsion, son of John, and ended as something else entirely. A name that crossed oceans. A name that absorbed enslaved people seeking new identities and immigrants seeking fresh starts. A name with no J in the language that created it. If your name is Jones, you're not just son of John. You're carrying the story of what happens when one culture tries to erase another and fails. You're carrying the proof that identity survives translation. Every surname has a story like this. Some are about professions, some are about fathers, some are about the color of your hair. This one is about a nation that lost its naming system and kept its name anyway. I'm Benjamin. This is the name you carry. And this was Jones. Here's a question that seems simple until you think about it. What do you call someone who made automobiles affordable to the middle class? A founding father who would rather die than live without liberty? A short story writer who invented the surprise ending? And the greatest running back of his generation? You call them Henry. But here's what makes this surname different from every other name in the series. Henry didn't just become a surname, it exploded into dozens of them. If your last name is Harris, or Harrison, or Henderson, or Hendricks, or Hendricks, or Hawkins, you're a Henry. You just don't know it yet. Let's start where the name started. In the forests of ancient Germania, more than 1,000 years before anyone called England home. The original name was Heimeric. It's a compound of 2 old Germanic elements, Heim, meaning home, Rick, meaning ruler or power. Put them together and you get ruler of the home. This wasn't a humble name. In an era when most people had one name and it described what they looked like or what they did for a living, Heimeric was a statement of ambition. It was a name you gave a son you expected to lead. The Germanic tribes understood something about names that we've largely forgotten. A name wasn't just identification. It was prophecy. It was a declaration of what you hoped your child would become. When the Romans encountered Germanic tribes, they Latinized it to Henricus. The name appears in church records across medieval Europe, carried by monks and nobles alike. When the Franks built their kingdoms across what's now France and Germany, they called their princes Heinrich. 7 German kings bore this name before the Normans ever set foot on English soil. The Holy Roman Empire saw Heinrich after Heinrich sit on its throne. And then, in 1066, everything changed. When William the Conqueror crossed the English Channel and defeated King Harold at the Battle of Hastings, he didn't just bring soldiers. He brought language. He brought culture. He brought names. Among them, Henri. The French had taken the Germanic Heinrich and softened it, the way French tends to soften hard consonants. Henri. And that's the version that arrived in England with the Norman aristocracy. But here's what's fascinating about the English. They didn't adopt Henri exactly as the French pronounced it. They couldn't quite manage that French vowel at the end. So they adapted it. In English mouths, Henri became Harry, not as a nickname, as the actual pronunciation. When medieval Englishmen spoke about their kings, they didn't say King Henry. They said King Harry. Shakespeare knew this. That's why he has the chorus in Henry V cry out for Harry, England, and St. George. This matters for what comes next, because when surnames began forming, they formed from how people actually spoke, not from how scribes wrote things down in Latin documents. No name in English history has sat on the throne more often than Henry, 8 times. And here's something most people don't realize. Only 2 of those 8 were actually born as heirs to the throne. The rest seized power through force, cunning, or the messy luck of having everyone ahead of them die. Henry I was William the Conqueror's 4th son. He grabbed the crown when his brother William II died in a hunting accident, which Henry himself may have arranged. He ruled for 35 years and earned a reputation for administrative competence, but his only legitimate son drowned in the White Ship disaster, triggering a civil war. Henry II built an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, married Eleanor of Aquitaine, and developed English common law. Then he watched his sons rebel against him one by one. He died cursing his children. Henry III became king at 9 years old during a civil war and spent his reign trying to please everyone, while pleasing no one. Henry IV seized the throne from Richard II and spent his reign fighting rebellions. Henry V, the warrior king, led an outnumbered army to impossible victory at Agincourt. Shakespeare would immortalize him. "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers." He died at 35, leaving an infant son. Henry VI inherited the throne as a baby, lost most of France, went mad, and was eventually murdered in the Tower of London. Henry VII ended the Wars of the Roses by defeating Richard III at Bosworth Field and founded the Tudor dynasty. And then there's Henry VIII, the man who wanted a son so badly that he divorced 2 wives, beheaded 2 more, and broke England away from the Catholic Church entirely. In the process, he dissolved the monasteries, doubled the crown's revenue, and fundamentally reshaped English religion, politics, and culture for the next 500 years. All 3 of his children would become monarchs. None would have children of their own. When the Tudor dynasty ended with Elizabeth I in 1603, Henry VIII's obsession with male heirs had achieved nothing. But his name? His name lived on. Remember, medieval Englishmen pronounced Henry as Harry. So when surnames began forming in the 13th and 14th centuries, when John the blacksmith's son became John Johnson, the sons of men named Henry didn't become Henrysons. They became Harrisons, and Harrises, and Harrys. Think about that for a moment. Harris, the 25th most common surname in America, with over 624,000 people, means son of Harry, which means son of Henry. Harrison, rank 141 with over 181,000 people, same thing. The name proliferated further. Henderson means son of Hendry, the Scottish form. Hendricks and Hendrickson come from the Dutch Hendrik. Hendricks is a variant spelling that became famous when a guitar player from Seattle made it legendary. In Wales, where surnames often began with ape, meaning son of, AP Harry became Perry. AP Henry became Penry. Even Hawkins may trace back to a diminutive form of Harry, Little Hawk, Little Harry. And here's one more. Henson, as in Jim Henson, creator of the Muppets. Son of Hen, son of Henry. If you gathered everyone in America whose surname derives from Henry, All the Harrises and Harrisons and Hendersons and Perrys and Hendrickses and Hensons, you'd have millions of people. The Henry family tree isn't a single branch. It's a forest. Let's talk about Henry itself, the name that kept its original form. According to the 2010 U.S. Census, approximately 171,000 Americans carry the surname Henry. That ranks it 149th in the country. Not enormous by the standards of Smith or Johnson, but substantial. Here's what makes Henry's demographics interesting. About 65% of American Henrys identify as white. About 29% identify as black. That's a significantly higher black population share than the national average. And it points to something specific in American history. The name Henry arrived in the American South early. It appeared in Virginia records as far back as 1651, when one Andrew Henry landed in the colony. As slavery expanded, the name Henry, sometimes given by enslavers, sometimes chosen by freed people after emancipation, became embedded in Black American family lineages. Today, Henry ranks among the surnames that bridge American communities. It's a name with roots in English monarchy and French aristocracy that became, over centuries, distinctly American. The highest concentrations? Texas, California, and Florida. But you'll find Henrys in every state. March 23, 1775. Richmond, Virginia. A lawyer named Patrick Henry stood before the Second Virginia Convention. The American colonies were debating what to do about Britain. Some urged caution, negotiation, patience. Patrick Henry had no patience left. He was 38 years old, the son of a Scottish immigrant father and a Virginia mother. He'd failed as a store clerk, failed as a farmer, watched his farmhouse burn down, moved into his father-in-law's tavern. Then he found his calling, the law. And in the courtroom, he discovered he could do something no one else could. He could speak. Not just argue, not just persuade. He could ignite. He had learned from watching evangelical preachers during the Great Awakening, men who spoke not to convince, but to transform. In 1765, just 5 years after passing the bar, Henry stood in the Virginia House of Burgesses and railed against the Stamp Act with such force that other legislators accused him of treason. His response: "If this be treason, make the most of it." Now 10 years later, as war with Britain seemed inevitable, Henry gave the speech that would define him forever. Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? He knew how to build to a climax. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty, or give me death. Patrick Henry would serve 5 terms as governor of Virginia. He would help draft the Virginia Declaration of Rights, a document that influenced the U.S. Bill of Rights. He would fight against the Constitution until those first 10 amendments were added. He fathered 17 children across 2 marriages. He turned down appointments from George Washington, Secretary of State, Supreme Court Justice, Ambassador to Spain. He wanted to stay home. He died on June 6, 1799, at his Virginia plantation called Red Hill. He was 63 years old. The surname Henry, ruler of the home, had produced a man who demanded to rule himself, or not at all. Henry Ford was born on a farm near Dearborn, Michigan on July 30, 1863. He was the eldest of 6 children. By the age of 12, he was spending most of his spare time in a machine shop he'd equipped himself. At 15, he built his first steam engine. His father wanted him to take over the farm. Henry wanted to build machines. What fascinated Ford wasn't steam. It was the internal combustion engine. The idea that you could harness controlled explosions to move a carriage without a horse. In 1896, he completed his first automobile, the quadricycle. It was basically a frame with 4 bicycle wheels and a 2-cylinder engine. He built it in a shed behind his house, and when he finished, he realized it was too wide to fit through the door. He had to knock out part of the wall to get it onto the street. He sold that first car to fund a better version. He formed one company, which failed, formed another, which became Cadillac after he left. Finally, in 1903, he got it right. Ford Motor Company was incorporated with $28,000 in cash from 12 investors. Ford owned about a quarter of the stock. In 1908, Ford introduced the Model T. And here's where he changed history. Previous automobiles were luxury items, playthings for the wealthy. Ford wanted a car that farmers and factory workers could afford. He pioneered the moving assembly line. He reduced the time to build a car from 12 hours to 93 minutes. He dropped the price of the Model T from $850 in 1908 to $290 by 1926. In 1914, he did something even more radical. He raised the minimum wage at his factories to $5 a day, more than double the industry standard, and cut the workday from 9 hours to 8. People called him a socialist. People called him a genius. He called it good business. By 1918, half of all cars in America were Model Ts. Henry Ford didn't just build automobiles. He built the American middle class's ability to move freely across a continent. He helped create the suburbs, the highway system, the entire geography of modern American life. He died on April 7, 1947. He was 83 years old. In 1999, Fortune magazine named him the businessman of the century. William Sidney Porter was born in Greensboro, North Carolina, in 1862. His mother died when he was 3. He worked in his uncle's pharmacy, becoming a licensed pharmacist by 19, moved to Texas, worked on a ranch, became a bank teller, got accused of embezzlement, fled to Honduras. When he learned his wife was dying, he came back and turned himself in. He spent 3 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary. In prison, Porter worked as a pharmacist, and he started writing short stories. He needed a pen name, something to hide his identity as a convicted felon. He chose O. Henry. Why O. Henry? Nobody knows for certain. Maybe it was a guard's name. Maybe it was from a pharmacy reference book. Etienne Ossien Henry, a French pharmacist. Maybe it was a coded reference to the Ohio Penitentiary itself. What matters is what he did with it. After his release in 1901, Porter moved to New York City and wrote prolifically. He published nearly 400 short stories in the next decade. Stories about ordinary people, shopgirls, policemen, drifters, caught in situations where fate pivots on a single unexpected moment. His most famous story, The Gift of the Magi, tells of a young couple so poor that each secretly sells their most precious possession to buy a gift for the other. She sells her beautiful hair to buy a chain for his watch. He sells his watch to buy combs for her hair. The twist at the end. The irony. The recognition that love matters more than logic. That's O. Henry's signature. And that's his legacy. He died in 1910, only 47 years old. But people still leave 187 in coins on his grave in Asheville, North Carolina. The exact amount his character Della had saved at the beginning of The Gift of the Magi. The surprise ending lives on. Derek Lamar Henry Jr. was born on January 4, 1994, in Yulee, Florida. By the time he finished high school, he had set the national record for career rushing yards, 12,124 yards, breaking a mark that had stood for nearly 60 years. At the University of Alabama, he won the Heisman Trophy in 2015 and broke Herschel Walker's SEC single-season rushing record. In the NFL, he became something else entirely. At 6'3" and 247 pounds, Derrick Henry is built like a linebacker who runs the football. He doesn't juke defenders. He runs through them. And when they try to tackle him, they often fail. In 2020, he rushed for 2,027 yards, only the 8th player in NFL history to break 2,000. He's the only player ever to rush for 2,000 yards at the high school, college, and professional levels. His nickname, King Henry. Because when you carry the ball like royalty, the name fits. Today, playing for the Baltimore Ravens after 8 seasons in Tennessee, Henry continues climbing the all-time rushing lists. He's past Jim Brown, past Tony Dorsett. He's currently 10th all-time in career rushing yards and climbing. He's joined LaDainian Tomlinson as the only players with 10 or more rushing touchdowns in 8 consecutive seasons. At 31 years old, ancient for a running back, he shows no signs of slowing down. The surname that once meant ruler of the home now means something else on Sundays in America. It means good luck stopping him. If your name is Henry, or Harris, or Harrison, or Henderson, or any of the dozens of surnames this name has spawned, here's what you carry. You carry the ambition of ancient Germanic tribes who named their sons for power. You carry the legacy of 8 English kings, for better or worse, some brilliant, some monstrous, all consequential. You carry Patrick Henry's refusal to compromise on liberty. You carry Henry Ford's belief that innovation should serve ordinary people, not just the wealthy. You carry O. Henry's faith that a good story needs a good twist. You carry Derrick Henry's proof that the name still means something on the field. And you carry whatever your own family added to the name. The migrations, the marriages, the choices made under pressure, the moments of courage and the moments of compromise. A surname isn't just etymology, it's not just history. It's a rope connecting you to everyone who carried it before. Here's the final thought. Most surnames in this series are standalone. Smith means blacksmith. Brown means brown. Johnson means son of John. Henry is different. Henry fractured into Harris, and Harrison, and Henderson, and Hendricks, and Harry, and Perry, and Henson, and a dozen more. The name didn't just survive the centuries, it proliferated. And maybe that's fitting. Because Henry, Hymeric, means ruler of the home. And rulers don't just occupy space, they expand it. They build, they multiply their influence. So if your name is Henry, you're not carrying just one surname. You're carrying the root of an entire family of names that spread across the English-speaking world. That's the story of Henry. A name forged from ambition, a declaration that the child who bore it would rule, at least within his own walls. A name that 8 kings carried to the throne, and millions of ordinary people carried across oceans. It's not a story of description. It's not a story of occupation. It's a story of aspiration, of a parent, more than 1,000 years ago, who looked at their newborn son and said, "This one will lead." Every surname has a story like this. If your name is Henry, or Harris, or Harrison, or Henderson, or any of the names this one became, now you know. You're connected to everyone who ever carried that ancient wish for power, for home, for something worth ruling. And to the kings and patriots and inventors and storytellers who proved the name right. If your name isn't Henry, drop it in the comments. Tell me your surname, because next time, it might be yours. Hit subscribe if you want to know more. New surname stories are coming. I'm Benjamin. This is the name you carry. And this was Henry.